Tonight, I've gathered some of the most chilling stories to send shivers down your spine. Each tale will take you deeper into the unknown, where shadows linger and fear takes root. If you're ready to explore the darkest corners of imagination, stay with me. And don't forget to subscribe and like to never miss another haunting tale. Let's begin. Daniel had been searching for a place to live for weeks when he stumbled upon the old apartment building on a quiet, forgotten street. The rent was cheap, the rooms were spacious, and the landlord seemed eager to hand over the keys. The only strange thing, a single door in the corner of the living room, locked tight. "That door stays closed," the landlord warned, his voice low and firm. "Don't ask questions and don't try to open it." At first, Daniel thought little of it. The apartment had everything he needed, and the price was too good to pass up. But as days turned into weeks, the locked door began to gnaw at his curiosity. Some nights, as he lay in bed, he could swear he heard faint creaks from behind the door, as though someone, or something, was moving inside. One night, unable to sleep, Daniel sat on the couch, staring at the door. The air in the room felt heavier, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual. He approached the door cautiously, pressing his ear against the wood. Silence. Then, a faint tapping. "Hello?" Daniel whispered, his voice shaky. No response. The next day, he couldn't shake the feeling that the door was watching him. Every time he passed it, he felt the weight of unseen eyes on his back. His reflection in the living room mirror began to disturb him. It looked the same, yet off, as if his reflection knew something he didn't. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, Daniel decided to act. He bought a lock-picking kit and spent hours learning how to use it. Finally, one stormy night, with rain pelting against the windows, he knelt before the door. The lock clicked open. Daniel hesitated before slowly pushing the door ajar. The room beyond was pitch black, the air freezing and thick with the scent of damp wood. He stepped inside, flashlight in hand. The beam illuminated a small, empty space. The walls were bare except for one strange feature, a full-length mirror standing directly across from the door. Daniel approached the mirror, his reflection flickering in the weak light. But as he stepped closer, his heart nearly stopped. His reflection wasn't mimicking his movements. Cliffhanger. It raised a hand to wave, its lips curling into a smile. "I've been waiting for you," it whispered. Daniel stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering wildly as his reflection stepped closer to the glass, its smile widening. What is this?" he stammered, his breath fogging in the icy air. The reflection tilted its head, its movements smooth and deliberate, entirely independent of Daniel. "You opened the door," it said, its voice low and distorted. "Now, you've let me in." Daniel's heart raced. "Let you in? What are you?" The reflection chuckled, a hollow, bone-chilling sound. "I am what this room sees. Every fear, every shadow, every secret you've tried to hide. I am all of it." Suddenly, the room shifted. The door slammed shut behind Daniel, and the walls began to ripple like the surface of disturbed water. The mirror pulsed, the glass shimmering as if it were alive. "You wanted to see what was inside," the reflection continued. "Now you'll see everything." Daniel turned to the door and tugged at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The room seemed to grow smaller, the shadows pressing closer. The mirror's surface rippled, and his reflection began to change, its features twisting into something grotesque. Its eyes turned black, and its mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "You can't leave," it hissed. "Not without playing the game." "What game?" Daniel demanded, his voice cracking. The reflection grinned. "Find the real you before the mirror takes your place. Forever." The shadows around the room shifted, forming figures that mirrored Daniel's outline. Each one had his face. Each one moved slightly out of sync, their hollow eyes locked on him. "Choose wisely," the reflection taunted. "You only get one chance." Daniel's head spun as the figures began to close in. He tried to focus, but the flickering light made it impossible to tell which one was real. His reflection stepped back into the mirror, its grin now impossibly wide. The shadows whispered in unison. "Time's running out." Desperation gripped him. Daniel lunged toward the closest figure, his hands shaking as he reached out to touch it. The moment his fingers brushed its cold, empty form, a deafening roar filled the room. The figure dissolved into smoke, and the mirror's surface shattered, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed behind him. Cliffhanger. Daniel turned, only to see his own face smiling back at him from the shadows. "Wrong choice," it said, stepping forward. "Now, I'll take your life, and you'll stay here, watching." Emily wasn't the type to shop at antique stores, but the old brass clock in the dusty corner seemed to call to her. Its intricate design of vines and thorns wrapped around the face, and at its center, the hands pointed not to the time, but to a number, 72. "Does it work?" she asked the shopkeeper. The elderly man's eyes darkened. "It works, but you should leave it be." Ignoring the warning, Emily bought the clock and took it home, drawn by its strange beauty. She placed it on her mantle, admiring how it gleamed in the dim light. That night, she was woken by a faint ticking. Groggily, she glanced at the clock. The number had changed, 71. Confused, she tried winding it, but the hands wouldn't budge. She went back to bed, dismissing it as a mechanical quirk. The next day, the number had dropped to 70. No matter what she did, the countdown continued. By the time it reached 65, strange things began to happen. Emily noticed shadows lingering longer than they should. Her reflection in the mirror seemed delayed, her smile appearing a second after her own lips moved. One evening, as the clock ticked to 60, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Who will it be?" Emily's heart raced as she typed back, "What are you talking about?" No reply came, but when she glanced at the clock, the ticking grew louder. Her chest tightened, and an unsettling thought clawed at her mind. The clock wasn't counting time, it was counting down to something. The next morning, her friend Mark called her in a panic. "Emily, did you hear about Sophie? What happened?" She's gone. Found dead in her apartment last night." Emily froze. The last time she'd seen Sophie, the clock had hit 72. That night, as she stared at the clock now showing 59, the ticking seemed to echo her heartbeat. Then, her phone buzzed again. "It's your turn to choose." Cliffhanger. The clock's hands began to spin wildly, the numbers flashing in quick succession, and the room grew colder as a deep, guttural voice whispered, "Who will pay the price?" Emily's hands trembled as the room filled with the ticking, louder and more insistent. The clock's numbers flashed, settling on 59, and then the voice returned, deep and guttural. "Choose, or the clock will choose for you." She staggered back, her breath hitching. "Choose what?" she shouted into the empty room, her voice shaking. The reflection in the glass face of the clock twisted, showing a figure that wasn't her. It was darker, hollow-eyed, and smiling wickedly. Her phone buzzed again, another message. "One life for another. You decide who it will be." Panic surged through her veins. Her mind raced back to Sophie's death. Had the countdown chosen her? Was Mark next? She couldn't let that happen. "Why are you doing this to me?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The reflection in the clock flickered, the figure's grin widening. "Time must be paid for," it rasped. "One soul for every cycle. You hold the power now." Emily's chest tightened as the countdown ticked to 58. She felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of the choice. Her eyes darted to her phone, her contacts flashing before her eyes. Her parents, Mark, her co-workers. Suddenly, a thought struck her. "What if I don't choose?" she asked, her voice defiant. The room grew colder, and the voice snarled. "Then you will take their place. Your life will feed the clock." Emily's hands clenched into fists. Could she live with herself if she sacrificed someone else? Could she face the guilt? The shadowed figure in the clock watched her intently, as if savoring her torment. The clock's ticking slowed, each beat heavier, more deliberate. The number 57 flashed. She was running out of time. Desperate, Emily grabbed the clock and hurled it across the room. It hit the wall with a deafening crash, shattering into pieces. For a moment, the ticking stopped. But then, the air grew still, and a chilling laugh echoed around her. The broken clock began to reassemble itself, the pieces sliding back together as though untouched. Cliffhanger, when the clock fully reformed, its face now read 30, and Emily's reflection inside was gone, replaced by Mark's terrified face, his lips forming the words, "Help me." Ethan was returning from a late-night shift when the rhythmic clatter of the train lulled him into an uneasy sleep. When he awoke, the train had stopped and the carriage was empty. Groggy, he looked out the window and saw an unfamiliar station cloaked in fog. The sign above the platform read, "Bracken Moor." Though Ethan was sure it wasn't on his usual route, the station was eerily silent, with no sign of staff or passengers. Checking his watch, he realized the train had stopped far longer than a regular station stop. "Hello?" he called out, stepping onto the platform. His voice echoed, swallowed by the dense fog. The air smelled of damp earth and rusted metal. The train doors shut behind him with a hiss, and the engine groaned as it slowly pulled away, vanishing into the mist. Panic set in as Ethan realized he was stranded. He wandered through the station, noticing how the paint peeled from the walls and the wooden benches were rotted. Old posters for events long past flapped against the walls in the cold breeze. At the end of the platform, a rusted sign read, "Tickets for the return journey must be claimed before midnight." Ethan's heart sank. Midnight was less than an hour away. He hurried to the ticket booth, but the window was shattered, the interior covered in dust. As he turned, he noticed a faint light flickering from the far end of the platform. Approaching cautiously, he found an old ticket machine, its surface marred with scratches. A small screen flickered with static before displaying a chilling message, "Insert name to continue." His hand trembled as he typed in his name. The machine whirred, spitting out a single yellowed ticket. The words on it made his blood run cold. "One-way passage." Behind him, the faint sound of a train whistle echoed through the fog, though no train was in sight. The ground beneath him vibrated, and a deep guttural voice whispered from the shadows of the platform, "You can't leave, not yet." Cliffhanger. Ethan turned to see shadowy figures emerging from the fog, their hollow eyes fixed on him as the sound of an approaching train grew louder. Than's legs felt like lead as the shadowy figures emerged from the fog, their movements slow and deliberate. They wore tattered clothing, their hollow eyes glinting with a faint, eerie light. "You can't leave," one of them rasped, its voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. The whistle of the approaching train grew louder, its rumble shaking the platform. Ethan clutched the yellowed ticket in his hand, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, the train burst through the fog, a monstrous rusted locomotive screeching to a halt. Its windows were dark, and the door to the nearest carriage slid open with a metallic groan. Cold, stale air wafted out. "Board!" one of the figures hissed, pointing a skeletal finger toward the train. Ethan stepped back, shaking his head. "No, I don't belong here." The shadow figures moved closer, their hollow eyes unblinking. "You took the ticket. The train is waiting." Desperate, Ethan turned to run, but the platform stretched endlessly in both directions, the exit nowhere in sight. Behind him, the figures surrounded the open door, their whispers blending with the hum of the engine. "Your journey begins now," one said, its face inches from Ethan's. The train hissed, its engine growling impatiently. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to resist, but the figure's grip was cold and unyielding as they forced him toward the carriage. As his foot crossed the threshold, the interior of the train came into view. The seats were filled with pale, lifeless passengers, their faces frozen in silent screams. A low, rhythmic chant echoed from deeper within the car. "One-way passage, one-way passage." The doors slammed shut behind him, and the train jolted forward, picking up speed. Ethan stumbled down the aisle, his breath fogging in the frigid air. He felt the ticket burning in his hand, the words, "One-way passage," glowing faintly. Suddenly, a voice crackled through the intercom. "Next stop, nowhere." The train plunged into darkness, its windows showing only an endless void. Ethan's reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't his own. It was grinning, its hollow eyes burning with malevolence. Cliffhanger. As the chant grew louder, Ethan realized with dawning horror that the train wasn't taking him somewhere, it was taking him apart. Mia had never liked the idea of living alone, but the old Victorian house she inherited from her grandmother felt like a fresh start. It was quiet, secluded, and full of history. Too quiet, perhaps. The first night was uneventful, but by the second, she began to notice strange things. The faint creak of floorboards in the dead of night, the sound of a door softly closing when no one else was home. She convinced herself it was just the house settling. On the third night, she woke to a sound she couldn't ignore. It was a soft but unmistakable tapping, like fingernails against glass. Mia froze in bed, straining to hear. The sound came from the downstairs living room. Gripping a flashlight, she crept down the stairs, her heart pounding. When she reached the living room, the tapping stopped. Everything was still, the silence oppressive. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. No response. She turned to leave, but a faint noise made her stop, a shuffle, followed by the quiet creak of the old rocking chair in the corner. The chair moved ever so slightly, as though someone had just risen from it. Mia's breath caught as she swung the flashlight beam toward it. The chair was empty, but its slow, rhythmic creaking continued, as if mocking her. That's when she noticed it. The mirror above the fireplace. Her reflection wasn't moving. Mia's blood ran cold as the reflection smiled, a wide, unnatural grin. Then, it raised a finger to its lips in a chilling gesture of silence. The rocking chair stopped. Cliffhanger. Before Mia could react, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from upstairs, despite her knowing no one else was in the house. Mia's heart raced as the heavy footsteps above her grew louder, each one deliberate, echoing through the empty house. She clutched the flashlight, her hand trembling, and backed away from the mirror, her distorted reflection still grinning ominously. She froze at the base of the staircase, staring up into the darkness. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice cracking. The footsteps stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "You don't belong." The air grew colder, and a deep creak resonated from above, as if something impossibly heavy was shifting across the floor. Summoning her courage, Mia climbed the stairs, the flashlight flickering weakly in her grip. At the top, the hallway stretched longer than she remembered, its walls cloaked in shadow. The door to the master bedroom was ajar, a faint light spilling out from within. She pushed the door open, her breath catching. The room was empty, except for an old, dusty phonograph sitting in the corner, its needle scratching softly against the spinning record. Mia stepped closer, and the distorted sound became clearer. A voice, faint and distant, like a recording of a long-forgotten memory. "Run," it whispered, "before it finds you." Suddenly, the needle snapped to a halt, and the room plunged into silence. Mia turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind her, locking her inside. Her flashlight flickered again, and she gasped. The shadows in the room began to shift, pooling together in the center, forming the shape of a tall, humanoid figure. Its hollow eyes burned like embers, and its elongated fingers reached toward her. The whispers returned, louder now, coming from all directions. "Stay with us. Forever." Desperate, Mia grabbed the phonograph and hurled it at the figure. It shattered, and the room erupted into a deafening chorus of screams. The walls began to crack, dark tendrils snaking out, wrapping around her ankles. Cliffhanger. As Mia fought to free herself, she looked down and saw her reflection in the shards of the broken phonograph. Her own face twisted, her eyes hollow, and her lips mouthing a single word: "Welcome." It was a lazy Sunday afternoon when Leah spotted the street photographer in the park. His vintage camera and old-fashioned attire made him stand out, but it was his unsettlingly wide smile that caught her attention. "Free portraits," he announced, his voice warm yet oddly hollow. A moment, frozen in time, a memory to keep forever. Leah hesitated but felt inexplicably drawn to him. She agreed to have her portrait taken, figuring it'd be fun to have an old-fashioned photograph. The photographer positioned her by a gnarled oak tree, his smile unwavering. "Perfect," he murmured, adjusting the camera. "Now, smile." The shutter clicked, and for a moment, Leah felt an unnatural chill, as if the world around her had briefly stilled. "Come back tomorrow," the photographer said, handing her a small slip of paper. "Your portrait will be ready." That night, Leah couldn't shake a strange unease. Every time she caught her reflection, it seemed off. Her smile lingered too long, her eyes glinted with something unfamiliar. She chalked it up to nerves and went to bed. The next day she returned to the park, but the photographer was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a small sealed envelope lay on the bench where he'd been standing. Her name was scrawled across it in elegant handwriting. Inside was the photograph, but as Leah stared at it, her stomach twisted. It was her, but her expression wasn't the one she'd made. Her smile was too wide, her teeth sharp, her eyes hollow and cold. "What the?" she whispered, her hands shaking. As she glanced up at her reflection in a nearby fountain, her blood ran cold. Her mirrored self was grinning, the same unnatural smile from the photograph. Worse, it moved when she didn't, lifting a hand to wave slowly. Cliffhanger. The reflection leaned closer, its grin stretching impossibly wide as it whispered, "I've finally found you?" Leah stumbled back from the fountain, her heart racing as her reflection's unnatural grin widened. She blinked, hoping it was a trick of the light, but the reflection remained, its hollow eyes fixed on hers. "What do you want?" Leah whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heartbeat. The reflection tilted its head, its lips moving out of sync with Leah's. "You took the photograph," it said, its voice distorted and echoing. "Now the smile is mine to keep." Leah's hands trembled as she crumpled the photograph in her grip. "This isn't real," she muttered, backing away from the fountain. But the reflection's grin only grew more sinister. "It's very real. The photographer always takes something in return. And now, you're mine." Suddenly, the reflection began to crawl out of the water, its distorted body stretching unnaturally as it clawed its way toward her. Leah screamed and turned to run, but the park seemed to shift around her, the trees closing in, the air growing heavier. She fled toward her apartment, her legs burning, but when she burst through her front door, she froze. Every mirror in her home was fogged, and faint handprints smeared the glass. Her reflection stood in each one, grinning and whispering incomprehensible words. The crumpled photograph in her hand began to burn, its edges curling into ash. Leah dropped it, her panic mounting as the mirrors started to crack, thin fractures spreading like veins. "You can't escape," the reflections hissed in unison. "The smile is yours now." Desperate, Leah smashed the largest mirror with a nearby chair, shards raining down around her. But instead of breaking the spell, the cracks spread to every reflective surface in the room, dark smoke seeping through the fractures. The shadows gathered in the center of the room, forming the unmistakable shape of the photographer, his wide grin gleaming in the dim light. "Time to take your place," he said, his voice like grinding glass. Cliffhanger. As Leah's reflection stepped out of the shattered mirror, it grabbed her arm and pulled her in, leaving only a faint, eerie smile behind in the glass. Jake had always been drawn to mysteries, and when he heard about the legend of Black Hollow, a town submerged beneath the waters of Lake Eldon, he knew he had to see it for himself. Locals whispered of ghostly figures seen walking along the lake's edge and the chilling sounds of church bells tolling beneath the waves. Armed with diving gear and a headlamp, Jake launched his small boat at dawn, the mist rolling over the lake's surface like ghostly fingers. By noon, he reached the deepest part of the lake, where Black Hollow supposedly lay. Jake slipped into the water, the cold biting through his wetsuit. As he descended, the world above faded into a murky blur, replaced by an eerie silence. The deeper he went, the darker it grew, until his headlamp caught the first sign of the town. A crumbling steeple, the cross atop it half rotted but still standing. Excitement coursed through him as the rest of the town came into view. Dilapidated houses, a cobblestone street covered in silt, and rusted street lamps leaning at odd angles. Everything seemed eerily preserved, as though frozen in time. He swam closer to one of the houses and peered through a broken window. Inside, furniture remained intact, though waterlogged and covered in moss. But then he saw something that made his blood run cold, a set of muddy footprints leading from the back of the house toward the street. Jake turned sharply, scanning the area. His headlamp flickered, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure standing in the distance, its form shrouded in the murky water. "Hello?" Jake's voice sounded hollow in his scuba mask, swallowed by the vast, watery silence. The figure didn't move. Jake's breathing quickened as he swam closer, but as he neared, the figure vanished. His headlamp caught movement behind him. a flicker of something darting between the buildings. The sound of faint, distorted church bells echoed through the water, sending a chill down his spine. Turning toward the sound, Jake saw the massive double doors of the town's church, slightly ajar, as though inviting him in. Cliffhanger. As Jake hesitated, a hand shot out from the darkness of the church doorway, clawing at the water, reaching for him. Jake recoiled, his heart pounding as the pale, skeletal hand grasped at the water in front of him. He kicked backward, his movement stirring clouds of silt that obscured his vision. The distorted toll of the church bells grew louder, their deep, mournful sound vibrating through the water. Forcing himself to calm down, Jake focused his headlamp on the church doors. They creaked open wider, revealing an interior cloaked in darkness. The hand was gone, leaving only faint ripples in the murky water. Against his better judgment, Jake swam toward the church, drawn by a strange compulsion. The bell tolls echoed through his skull, each one heavier than the last. As he passed through the doorway, his headlamp flickered, revealing long rows of pews and a pulpit draped in tattered, algae-covered cloth. Then he saw them, figures seated in the pews. At first, Jake thought they were statues, but as his light passed over them, their heads turned in unison, hollow eyes locking onto him. Jake's breath caught in his throat as the figures slowly stood, their movements jerky, unnatural. Their faces were gaunt, their mouths hanging open in silent screams. A voice crackled through the water, low and guttural. "You shouldn't have come." Panicking, Jake turned to flee, but the church doors slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside. The figures began to advance, their skeletal hands reaching for him. Desperate, Jake swam toward the altar, where a rusted ancient bell hung from the ceiling. Beneath it lay an inscription carved into the stone floor. "The toll must be paid." The voice spoke again, now deafening. "One must stay for the rest to sleep." Jake's head spun as the figures closed in, their hollow eyes burning with an unnatural glow. He realized with horror what the voice meant. Someone had to take their place to end the curse. Before he could react, one of the figures lunged at him, its icy grip locking around his wrist. Jake struggled, but it was no use. Cliffhanger. As the bell above began to toll again, the figure dragged Jake toward the altar, whispering, "Now, you belong to Black Hollow." Eric wasn't one to celebrate his birthday. After his family drifted apart and friends came and went, the day became just another mark on the calendar. But on the morning of his 30th birthday, a strange invitation arrived in his mailbox, an ornate, cream-colored envelope sealed with wax. The invitation was handwritten in elegant cursive. "You are cordially invited to your forgotten birthday party, tonight at 8 p.m., 12 Blackwood Lane. Attendance is mandatory." Eric frowned. Blackwood Lane was a deserted road on the outskirts of town, and he couldn't think of anyone who'd send such a mysterious invitation. Was this some kind of prank? Yet something about the message drew him in. By 7:30 p.m., curiosity won. He drove out to Blackwood Lane, the road winding through dense, fog-covered woods. At the end of the lane stood an old, decrepit mansion, its windows glowing faintly in the darkness. He hesitated before knocking on the heavy oak door. To his surprise, it creaked open on its own, revealing a grand but decaying ballroom. Faded streamers hung from the ceiling, and a long table was set with flickering candles, dusty plates, and a single towering cake. The air was thick and cold, carrying the faint sound of music, though no source was visible. As Eric stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the room. "Welcome, Eric," a voice said. He turned to see a group of people standing in the shadows. As they stepped into the candlelight, Eric's stomach twisted. They were all versions of himself, older, younger, some with haunted eyes, others with faint smiles. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice trembling. One of them, a grizzled version with streaks of gray in his hair, stepped forward. "It's your party," he said. "We're all you, from lives you could have lived." The music grew louder, distorted and unsettling, as the grizzled version gestured to an empty chair at the head of the table. "But tonight," he continued, his tone dark, "only one of us gets to leave." Cliffhanger. The candles flickered violently as the other versions of Eric began to chant, their voices overlapping. The choice must be made. Eric's heart pounded as the chant grew louder, the overlapping voices sending chills down his spine. The versions of himself gathered around the table, their faces illuminated by the flickering candlelight. "What do you mean, only one of us gets to leave?" he demanded, his voice shaking. The grizzled version smirked, his eyes cold. "The lives you never lived, the paths you never took. We've been waiting here, trapped in this house. But every 30 years, one of us gets a chance to move on. You were invited to decide." Eric's legs felt like they might give out. Decide what? The youngest version of him, barely a teenager, stepped forward, his voice trembling. "You choose who stays and who goes." The room seemed to shrink, the oppressive air growing heavier. The other versions of Eric stared at him, their expressions a mix of desperation, fear, and cold detachment. "This is insane," Eric whispered. "I'm leaving. I didn't ask for this." He turned to the door, but the grizzled version's voice stopped him cold. "If you don't choose, the house will decide for you, and believe me, you won't like its choice." Eric spun back around, his eyes darting to the long table. On it were objects he recognized from different points in his life: a childhood toy, a high school trophy, a journal he'd stopped writing in years ago. They were relics of the lives he could have lived. The grizzled version gestured toward the empty chair again. "Sit, choose, or stay here forever." The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. The faces around him flickered like distorted reflections in a cracked mirror. With no other choice, Eric sank into the chair, his hands shaking. "How do I decide?" The youngest version of himself placed a small, cracked hourglass in front of him. "Flip it," he said softly. "When the sand runs out, the one who stays will be revealed." Eric hesitated, his fingers hovering over the hourglass. "And if I don't flip it?" The grizzled version leaned in close, his breath cold against Eric's ear. "Then you'll stay here, as the house's prisoner." Cliffhanger. Eric's hand trembled as he flipped the hourglass. The room darkened, the flickering light illuminating only the swirling sand as the voices around him whispered, "Who will it be?" David woke to a strange sensation on his forearm, like a faint itch beneath his skin. Groggy, he stumbled into the bathroom and flipped on the light. His breath caught as he stared at his arm. A tattoo had appeared overnight. It was a simple design, an old-fashioned clock face without a frame, the hands pointing to 12 o'clock. The ink looked fresh, as if it had been etched into his skin hours ago. "What the hell?" he muttered, running his fingers over it. The skin was smooth, unbroken. He didn't have time to dwell on it. Late for work, David threw on his clothes and rushed out the door. But all day he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The tattoo seemed to tick faintly, though no one else could hear it. By evening, the hands had moved. 11:45. Panic set in. He hadn't touched it, hadn't wound anything, yet the clock was counting down. But to what? That night, David dreamt of shadowy figures standing in a circle, their faces obscured. A deep, rhythmic ticking echoed in the background, growing louder and more insistent. One figure stepped forward, its hollow voice chilling him to the bone. "Time is a debt, and every debt must be paid." David jolted awake, drenched in sweat. The clock now read 11:30. He decided to visit a tattoo parlor the next day, hoping someone could explain it. The artist examined the tattoo, her expression turning grim. This isn't normal ink," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not ink at all. It's alive." Before David could respond, the clock ticked audibly, loud enough for both of them to hear. The artist stepped back, eyes wide. "Get rid of it," she whispered, "before it runs out." David left in a daze, his mind racing. By the time he got home, the clock had ticked down to 11:15. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Choose someone to reset the clock, or it's your turn." Cliffhanger. David stared at the message as the ticking grew louder, and a shadow moved across the room, whispering, "Time's almost up." David's hands trembled as he reread the text. His heart pounded in sync with the relentless ticking on his arm. The clock now read 11:10. The shadow in the corner shifted, its presence growing heavier, colder. A low whisper filled the room. "Time cannot stop unless you pass it on." "No!" David shouted, backing against the wall. "I'm not doing this." The shadow didn't move, but its voice grew sharper, slicing through the room like a blade. "You have no choice. Choose someone, or the clock chooses you." David's mind raced. He thought of his co-workers, his distant family, the strangers he passed on the street. Could he condemn someone else to save himself? The clock ticked down to 11:05. Desperate, David grabbed his phone and dialed his best friend, Matt. "Hey man," David stammered, his voice shaky. I need to see you. It's urgent." Matt, always the reliable one, agreed to come over. Minutes later, he arrived, his usual smile faltering when he saw David's pale, frantic face. "What's going on?" David hesitated, guilt twisting in his stomach. "It's this tattoo. It's counting down to something, and I don't know what will happen when it hits 0. Matt frowned, confused. "A tattoo? Dude, you're freaking me out." The clock ticked to 11:01, and the shadow in the corner loomed larger. David's breathing quickened. "Please, just stay with me," he begged. The shadow spoke again, its voice reverberating through the room. "Last chance. Pass the time, or lose everything." Matt's eyes widened as he seemed to hear the voice for the first time. "What the hell was that?" The clock ticked to 11 o'clock, and a piercing sound filled the air, like metal grinding against metal. The tattoo's hands began to glow, and David felt an unbearable heat spreading through his arm. "Matt, I'm sorry," David choked out, tears streaming down his face. He reached out, gripping Matt's wrist. The glow transferred instantly, and the tattoo faded from David's arm, reappearing on Matt's. Matt stumbled back, clutching his arm in horror. "What did you do?" Before David could answer, the shadow vanished, and the room fell deathly silent. The ticking had stopped. For him. Cliffhanger. As Matt stared at the glowing tattoo now etched into his skin, his phone buzzed with a text from the same unknown number. "Time resets. Choose wisely." It was past midnight when Adam drove home from a late shift, the winding country road eerily deserted. His headlights cut through the thick fog, illuminating little beyond the crumbling asphalt ahead. His GPS flickered before recalculating, displaying a route he didn't recognize. Turn left onto Braxton Lane. Adam frowned. He'd never seen this road before, but his curiosity got the better of him. The narrow street was lined with towering, gnarled trees whose branches formed a tunnel overhead. The further he drove, the denser the fog became, swallowing the road behind him. After several minutes, the headlights caught the faint outline of buildings. A small, old-fashioned diner appeared, its neon sign buzzing weakly. "Open 24 hours. Across the street stood a gas station, its pumps rusted and covered in ivy. Everything seemed frozen in time. Adam parked near the diner and stepped out, the cold night air biting at his skin. He pushed open the door, and a small bell jingled. Inside, the place was empty except for a waitress who stood motionless behind the counter. Her eyes were blank, and her expression unnervingly neutral. "Coffee?" she asked in a flat tone, not moving. Sure," Adam replied uneasily, sitting at the counter. The coffee appeared before him, as though she hadn't moved a muscle. Adam glanced around. The walls were lined with black and white photographs of the town, but the streets in the pictures were different, warped, like they didn't belong to the same place. He picked up one of the photos. In the background, faint shadows of figures lingered, their faces blurred beyond recognition. "Where am I?" Adam asked, his voice low. The waitress turned her head slowly, her blank stare locking onto him. "You're where you're supposed to be," she said, her lips barely moving. The bell above the door jingled again, but no one had entered. Instead, the fog outside grew thicker, pressing against the glass like a living thing. Adam's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You found it, but can you leave?" Cliffhanger. The door slammed shut behind him, and the shadows in the photos began to shift, their blurred faces turning to stare directly at Adam. Adam's breath caught as he stared at the shifting shadows in the photographs. Their blurred faces sharpened just enough to reveal hollow eyes and twisted grins. He dropped the photo, the glass frame shattering against the tiled floor. The waitress didn't react. She stood still, her gaze now fixed on the door. "The street decides who stays," she murmured. "What do you mean?" Adam demanded, his voice cracking. Instead of answering, she pointed to the window. Outside, the fog swirled violently, the streetlights flickering in and out of existence. The gas station across the road was gone, replaced by an old, crumbling theater with its marquee reading, "One night only, the last show." Adam's heart raced as he turned to the door. "I'm leaving." The waitress smiled faintly. "You can try." He burst through the diner door, the fog wrapping around him like icy fingers. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly, though he could see no one. Every turn he took brought him back to the same spot, a single lamppost in the center of the street, its light flickering erratically. The text on his phone changed. "Every street has a story. Yours ends here." Panic surged through him as he turned a corner, only to find himself in front of the diner again. The once empty booths were now filled with shadowy figures, their faces eerily similar to his own, but twisted with age, despair, and something darker. One of them stood and pointed toward him, its voice a distorted version of his own. "You've joined us." Adam stumbled backward, but the street itself seemed to shift beneath his feet, the ground cracking and splitting like fractured glass. The fog thickened, and the buildings began to crumble, revealing a void beyond the street's edge. He ran, but no matter how fast he moved, the lamppost remained in sight, the figures from the diner now standing beneath it, watching. The waitress appeared beside him, her voice cold and final. "The vanishing street doesn't let its travelers leave. It keeps their stories forever." Cliffhanger. The fog swallowed Adam as the street dissolved around him, his last sight being his reflection in the lamppost's glass, his face now hollow, grinning, and trapped.